You know, whenever something is invented with technology, you know, a new camera, a new device, we should somehow come up with a way to use it what the inventor didn't think of, you know, so that we use it. It's a détournement, a situation, détournement. We use it in an unexpected way, you know. And Instagram was clearly not invented to be a platform for publishing handwritten notes.
We're going to talk about this book. How did this project come about, Hans? If you tell us the genesis of it.
It sort of began, like all my projects, they sort of don't really have, you know, a top-down master plan. They kind of evolve almost kind of out of serendipity, so kind of organically. So I was with Umberto Eco, the late Umberto Eco, in Milan, and he used to live in this amazing apartment full of books. You know, it was like really a book kind of shrine, I would say. He had the research for all his books, but there was also a room where he had all his original medieval kind of books, handwritten books, very rare books, and only he had the key, you know, like none of his assistants or family had the key. So he took the key, opened this secret door, locked it behind himself, and I was there with him alone. It was a bit scary because it felt a bit like, for those of you who read In the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, you know, had a bit of that feel. And then I left the apartment after a long conversation, and he said, I'm really concerned, you know, handwriting disappears and in this digital age, and we need to do something to save handwriting. And I'm very old, you know, I can't really do this anymore. This is for you. I want to give you a task. And that's anyway happened quite a lot when I worked with artists or, you know, or philosophers or scientists. So very often out of the conversation comes an idea and they sort of say, you should do this or that. And, you know, and sometimes it's a really good idea. But I left his apartment sort of a little bit puzzled because I'm not an expert of calligraphy. You know, he said we should have calligraphy schools. We should have. I'm not the right person to organize that. But you know, I kept it in my mind. And then a few weeks later, I was with another artist friend, Ryan Tricartin. It was 12 years ago, in the beginning of Instagram, and he was quite an early, you know, starter with Instagram. He had a lot of followers very early, Ryan. He was anyway one of the first artists, you know, who used social media, also in his films. So he took my phone and downloaded, you know, the app, the Instagram app, and told all his followers that I had joined Instagram. So all of a sudden there was a kind of a weird pressure, you know, that I should do something with this app. And all I knew is what I did not want to do. I didn't want to, you know, do selfies. I didn't want to photograph my meals. I also thought, you know, studio visits was, you know, sometimes, but very often it's slightly too intimate when I go to studios. You don't want to put this on Instagram because it's actually a very, you know, intimate private space where artists have works which are not finished, right? So one wouldn't really put that on Instagram. So I knew exactly what I didn't want to post, but I really had no idea what I wanted to post. And all I knew is that it had to somehow be, you know, a project. I wouldn't just post whatever, different things, because then it's going to be a headache every day what I'm going to post. So it needs to be a rule of the game. You know? Like most of my shows, like Do It also, for example, where artists write instruction, they kind of have a rule of the game. But I still had no idea. So weeks passed and there was more peer pressure, and Ryan texted, you still haven't posted anything, a problem. So, and then, you know, as often these things happen when you expect them least. We were on holidays, actually on end of the year holidays with my partner Kushonga, the artist, and also with Etel Adnan, whom Joe you knew very well, and Simon Fatal, whom you know well, the two, you know, amazing artists and poets from Lebanon who live in Paris, and they had invited Ku and me to kind of go on a holiday in Bretagne, in Brittany, in France, and you know, at the end of the year, the weather there is really miserable. So we went on a walk, and then this rainfall started, and he had to find shelter in a cafe. And it went on for hours and hours, really heavy rain, so we were stuck there, right? And so for about 2 or 3 hours, we had like the most fantastic conversation on art and poetry. And then after about 2 or 3 hours, you know, the inevitable thing happened that, you know, Ku and Simon and I, you know, went on our smartphones and started to answer a few emails, a few texts, kind of waiting for the rain to stop. But Etel, you know, she died when she was 96, like a year and a half ago. But, you know, at that time she was already, I would say, in her 80s. And she obviously didn't have a smartphone. So she took out her little notebook and started to write a poem, right? And just the beauty of this act, right? Just me watching her write, and suddenly it all sort of came together. I sort of remembered Umberto Eco giving me this mission. I remembered, oh, I have this Instagram waiting. So I just took a photo and a little film. I mean, exactly what happened now before, because Marina Abramovic was here, 30 minutes ago for the book launch, and Marina wrote, something which we're going to post in the next couple of days. She, of course, is in the book, but she also wrote a new thing, is not to do, is to be. And then she put her formula, right? Like infinite plus infinite is question mark. That is how, as she says, new formula. And Joe filmed it. And that's exactly kind of how it would happen. I would, the artist would write something, I would either photograph it or film it, and we put it online ever since that day. So in a way, it's a kind of a long story, but it evolved over about 6 months and then fell into place and has not stopped ever since. It's been going on for 12 years. I mean, there have been modifications of it and we can talk about that later, the exquisite corpse, there have been lots of new elements in it, but in substance, I mean, it has always kind of, gone on. Just when I meet artists, when I have interviews, conversations with artists, studio visits, I would post, like yesterday, I recorded a conversation with Steve McQueen, and we talked about Gerhard Richter and about a Meinhof painting of Gerhard Richter, which, he quoted in relation also to his, incredible Grenfell piece, his Grenfell work, which we showed, at the Serpentine earlier this year. Some of you might have seen. And so then I told him, I showed him the book, and obviously, Steve, from an earlier conversation, has posted here in the book, which is, Remember Me. And so I showed him the page of Gerhard Richter because he mentioned the Baader Meinhof paintings. And Gerhard Richter's quote is, art is the highest form of hope. So I said to Steve, do you have a definition of art? And he said, art is active freedom, So in that sense, it's really a daily project.
Amazing. Well, let me ask you, so that's useful, that explanation as to how it came to be, this project. But go back to the original where it was said that handwriting is important. Why is it important?
Yeah, I think in a way, first of all, I do think that things do disappear. We live in an age of homogenized globalization. It's not the first time the world experiences globalization, but it's certainly the most extreme globalization, fueled by technology, the world experiences. That brings a lot of new possibilities, but also actually leads to the disappearance of many things. As Gustav Metzger, who also contributed to the book, with his Remember Nature, sentence, the environmental activist and artist said, this globalization leads to extinction, mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction, as Elizabeth Colbert says. And that means the extinction of species, but it leads also to the disappearance of a lot of cultural phenomena, like languages disappear at enormous speed, as more than ever before, and things like handwriting, then we of course have to ask ourselves, why does it matter? That, why should it not disappear? And I think, first of all, I really do think that it's magical that two people never have the same handwriting, this idea that it's all about so many different possibilities. But also the idea that, in a way, there's an interesting piece in The Economist I actually just read last week, which sort of starts with this idea that Socrates complained that writing would harm students, because ultimately you would no longer sort of memorize when you write. And I think, in a way, it's interesting today, in relation to memory, that I think particularly when we write and immediately, digitally, the text writes itself, or almost finishes your sentence, so it forces us, when we handwrite, to maybe synthesize ideas, more into our own world. It's sort of, it's a conceptual understanding, which happens. And particularly also, I think it's always interesting when taking notes. I write a lot on the computer, of course, but when I have conversations with people, I would always handwrite the notes, because, in a way, it's almost like a synthesis of the conversation and all of that. So I do think that there is something related to memory. There is something also related to this idea of bringing it into our own words. Through the handwriting, we make it our own words, maybe more than when we type it.
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything you say, apart from my own perspective, the disappearance. I find things that I write disappear because I misplace them or end up throwing them away. And so one of the great advantages for me in the digital age is the storage of my words written. But in your preface, which is, I think, really brilliant, you mentioned another point, which is, I think, the texture of the pen or the pencil against the paper, that physicality of it, and also the ability it makes you think more before you write. Because what's happened to me, and as you know, I have been a lawyer for many years, and I started using Word and other sort of word programming things, but you didn't really have to think very much, because you would write 5 words, go back and delete number 3, go up to number 7, and you could just make it up as you go along. Whereas if you had to write it out in a pen or even a pencil, it made you think before you spoke. And that, to me, is a great discipline, personally, which you mentioned yourself in the preface. And I thought that was, and I can see how people's minds have changed without the ability to write. I remember one great lawyer sat down in front of me and wrote 7 beautiful pages in a fountain pen, a letter to a judge. And I'm afraid I can't do that, because I've just never been able to. And it's not just about handwriting, it's the interaction between your mind and the way you express yourself. And you mentioned that in the preface, which I think is amazing. The other thing you mentioned earlier is calligraphy. I'm a bit, maybe people are always ashamed of their handwriting, but I think my handwriting is terrible. I think my voice is terrible when I hear myself speak, so maybe it's the same thing. But I wonder whether the world would be better on your project if everybody did calligraphy and everybody wrote exactly the same. Or is it better that everybody, according to you, it's the individuality is important, so everyone just writes differently is better, and that stops the standardization, the globalization of things?
It's also got to do a lot with, doodling, no? So the idea, in a way, that, and you can see that a lot in the book, that the handwritten notes, there's very often a space really between handwriting and drawing, like posts kind of go from a written word into a drawing, and that's something which I think is also incredibly important, this idea that, very often, if it's with art or architecture, lots of things grow out of this activity of doodling. And it doesn't necessarily mean that this has to happen in an analog way. It can also happen in a digital way, with the stylus. I mean, we have also handwriting is coming back now and doodling, with the stylus on the tablet. I think one thing which is also interesting, which contributed a lot to the disappearance, to the temporary, to handwriting being less present temporarily, had to do with the fact that there were no stylus in the smartphones initially. And that, of course, has to do with a fantastic design decision, no? I mean, particularly with Apple, the genius design of these devices was just not compatible with this idea of having a stylus somewhere around, no? And that was a Steve Jobs decision, really, that he wasn't in favor of stylus, right? And so now, of course, with the tablets, I know a lot of artists who draw and sketch and doodle on the stylus. Now, one of the things which is also interesting, I think, in relation to this is that there is also some really specific cases where handwriting and drawing are then becoming one. For example, Barbara Chase Ribou, the legendary artist whom we showed at the Serpentine in a survey like earlier, actually, it was last year. She has something called automatic writing, and only she can really decipher it. It's kind of like, it's automatic writing. And there's always a kind of an interesting space between where is it, a secret writing, and where is it, at the end of the day, still decipherable. And I think my fascination for handwriting, I actually never thought about it until tonight, but because of your question, why I'm somehow attached to handwriting, it suddenly came to my mind tonight that maybe it has to do with my childhood in Switzerland, because I grew up in the eastern part of Switzerland, and that's where the legendary writer Robert Walser is one of the great writers of the 20th century. He was a friend of Franz Kafka. He somehow, after an exile to Berlin, which was real, and then a fictitious exile to Paris, which was imaginary, he went into an inner exile. I mean, there's all these different exiles, right? There's an outer exile, there's a fictitious exile, and then there's an inner exile, where he basically, lived in Switzerland and didn't travel anymore, and sort of his writing became smaller and smaller. It became microscopic writing. And so that's another type of handwriting, microscopic writing. And at the end of the day, no one could read it anymore. And so Werner Morlang, the late Werner Morlang, who was a friend of mine, the Swiss literary scholar, he spent decades, biggest part of his life, really, to just decipher these manuscripts of Robert Walser. And for many, many years, people had thought that it was actually a secret, that it was like here, he thought it was kind of like undecipherable, right? But he ultimately found the code, and he realized actually that there is you can find it also in English, there's a kind of a transcription, of that. And then, if you have the automatic writing of Barbara Chase-Ribot, we have Pierre Alechinsky, who is one of the, great pioneers of art in the 20th century. He's one of the main protagonists of the Cobra movement, and he's in his mid-90s now, and he's completely ambidextrous, which is really fascinating, right? So he can basically write with both hands at the same time, which is, extremely rare. And then you also have Daniel Buren, another legendary artist, who actually can immediately, without hesitation, very quickly write backwards. So, there are all kinds of, versions in a way, and special, possibilities of handwriting in this tiny little book.
Have you, obviously, how many artists have you asked to do this, and how many notes do you have?
Yeah, I kind of stopped counting at some point because it's really a daily practice, but we have so far on Instagram about 5,308 posts. And, I do sometimes post other things. So, sometimes I post, studio visits. I also, the Instagram has also a very important dimension of memory to remember, artists who pass away. It's kind of, there is an homage. It's kind of an homage page, a tribute page. Posted. So the great thing is that this is really volume 1, and we could imagine 40 more volumes.
But you haven't posted everything that's been written. I mean, every post-it that's done for you. Do you always post the post-its?
Yeah, I sort of generally post them. Yeah, there isn't censorship on my account.
No, I don't. No, I didn't mean censorship. I meant that I know you're with one artist who we both know, who just sat down and wrote out so many in one go, but that was unusual, I think.
No, that's such a good point. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it's actually true that in that sense, not everything, you're so right, not everything is always immediately posted, There is kind of an archive of post-its, no? And so I'm really glad you bring that up because it's actually, there is a sort of, it's almost in that sense also like a magazine, We have actually a lot of things to post always in an envelope and scanned, and then ultimately little by little post them. And the example you referred to, and that was an amazing moment, was when you and I were on a journey with Damien Hirst, and he basically wrote about 100. It was like
Just couldn't stop him, just one after another. Yeah.
And that also happened once with Estelle Adnan. She once did 50 in one session.
Has this whole project affected your attitude towards handwriting yourself and influenced you? And if so, how?
Yeah, I would say that in a way, I've always, handwritten notes from sort of conversations, and I think in a way, it did, yes, because as you said, the problem is that we always very often lose, handwritten notes and can't find them anymore and so on. And I think before I did this project, because now it's become almost like an automatism, whenever we're somewhere in a restaurant or in a studio visit and the artist writes it, I immediately photograph it, no? And then, in order for it to then be posted. And I would say that before we had this project, I never kind of photographed my own notes and then lost them. And I think now I photograph immediately when I write something, I'm in a dinner or something, or I'm in a meeting, or I'm in a conference, I photograph my notes immediately, so they also exist digitally. I kind of do believe, it's not the project which is against digital technology. It's very much, the 21st century should be about mixed reality, no? So it's a kind of a mixed reality idea. Because, it is on Instagram also. It is the project for Instagram. So it is, by definition, a digital project as well. And one of the things I haven't said before, is also that at the very beginning of the 90s, I met this philosopher, Wilhelm Flusser, and he said, whenever something is invented with technology, you know, a new camera, a new device, we should somehow come up with a way to use it what the inventor didn't think of, you know, so that we use it. It's a détournement, a situation, détournement. We use it in an unexpected way, you know. And Instagram was clearly not invented to be a platform for publishing handwritten notes, no. And so in a way, that's kind of also, I think, the idea.
Nor was it a platform for poetry, but poetry has become very big on Instagram too. You've told us a bit about the attitudes of different artists you've asked to write notes. Is there anything you can tell us about the pens and pencils and they use, or is there any system to it, or some have been particular about how they, you know, what they use to write it?
Yeah, that's also super interesting because it's very different, you know. So, for example, we were with Laurie Anderson, and she had very specific ink, you know. And sometimes when it's in artist studios, they have a very specific pen they always use, or pencil. But then very often it also happens, you know, at the concert backstage, after a concert, and then one just uses the pen which is there, no? So there's a kind of a mix between sometimes very, you know, I think also, yeah, David Hockney also used his pencil, you know, so sometimes it's really the artist in the studio using the pen or pencil they always have, and sometimes it's a bit more random.
Have you do you write yourself post-it notes of a similar thing? Have you ever written yourself one for?
Yeah, I've written down actually a couple of them. Yeah, and the one I always had on my desk is actually a quote from my late friend Leon Golob, who was a kind of a mentor. He and Nancy Spiro were mentors to me when I was a student, and he once told me in a letter, art is an open gate to possibility. And that quote, you know, obviously, you know, Leon had passed away, so I couldn't ask him to write it, so I hand wrote it, and I have it always on my desk, because I think it's a very beautiful quote and important to always remember. Yeah.
I mean, within each of these pages, there's handwriting, and sometimes there's a little bit of art, without getting too philosophical about what art is. There's like a drawing or a doodle, and sometimes there's a kind of aphorism as well. There's lots of things going on in these posters. There's something very meaningful and touches you. But even if you just have the aphorism, and if it were typed out, it feels different to when it's written by hand, like you and I knew Etel very well. And when you see her handwriting and you read it, it's different if it was just a text. I don't really understand that. Do you agree with me? And that just seeing her handwriting is, and I can almost imagine being next to her as she wrote it, and the speed with which she wrote, and hearing her pen on the paper. It just creates a totally different feeling. Do you agree with what I'm saying about?
Yeah, it's a lot to do with presence, no? It's about the presence of the person who in a way writes it. It's very embodied, you know. And one post-it which is missing in the book in terms of this embodiment and presence is the post-it by Ed Atkins, and that's a kind of a funny story, because we were having breakfast with the artist Ed Atkins, and he drew and wrote a wonderful post-it, and he told me that he wanted to photograph it because it was a breakfast meeting. You know, he wanted to photograph it on the toast with the butter, no? So, you know, we ordered butter and toast, and he glued a post-it on the butter on the toast, and asked me to make the photograph, and I posted it. But then, a few seconds later, no, he ate it. Yeah. So that's gone.
It's on rice paper, maybe. Right, maybe I can ask anyone from the audience who wants to say anything. So who has a question? Put your hand up, don't be shy.
Absolutely. I'm looking at this, and this represents a beautiful exhibition catalog. This is a curated exhibition. That's what I see here. And you're experiencing a Warholian moment using the Polaroid, and instead that you're using the Post-it thing. So, Joe, to you, how about, that's a suggestion, how about you do unique multiples of this catalog, and we see the real exhibition?
That's a good question, Ted, and obviously something that's gone through my mind, knowing that, knowing the HENI business of making it. And actually, we had a big discussion about here tonight whether we should put all of these on the wall in nice framed images, but I decided that really it wasn't an artwork nor an exhibition. It was simply about bits of paper and the book tonight, but maybe it'll change in the future. We have thought about other things, which is, I know this sounds a bit cheesy, but we thought about making T-shirts with some of these words because they do look good. So we have. It's not about commercializing it, but some of these words and the way they're written and the meaning is so beautiful. It's a shame to just only have them in the book. So we're thinking about it, but maybe you can add to what I've said.
No, it's a super interesting point, and of course one can connect also, both questions, because it also goes back to the archive, to your previous question about the archive. Because I, of course, also think that at a certain moment, one could imagine there to be, exhibitions archive exhibitions of this project, and of course libraries would be also maybe perfect sites for such exhibitions more than, one of my big unrealized projects would be to do an exhibition of this material in a place like the Morgan Library, something like that.
Point of departure.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a lot to think about.
And also in terms of the archive, also the idea of bringing all the disciplines together, which is why it's also, I think, interesting how this can travel in the world, in different formats and in different, one could imagine it, of course, to be T-shirts, one could imagine it to be postcards, one could imagine it to be exhibitions. It's of course important also that it brings all the disciplines together. You have music, there are composers like Arvo Pärt or Philip Glass are involved in my projects. They're basically, of course, visual artists. We already discussed this. There's fashion designers. Vivienne Westwood, in my last meeting with her, wrote, "The acorn is happy to become an oak." Aristotle, he defines happiness as fulfilling your potential. Follow your deep interests, forget yourself, and become who you are. So we have pop music, we have composers, we have fashion in the book. As Joe mentioned, there is poetry, as we already mentioned, literature. Sadie Smith, who asks, the question is how to live the time of your life, the intimate time of your life alongside the time of history. Which should you devote yourself to? Which deserves your attention? Which is real? We have also in the book architects, which is important. A very beautiful sentence from Richard Rogers, the late Richard Rogers, whom I want to remember here, who said, "I promise to leave this city better than I entered it," which I think is always, it's a beautiful thing to think about when we wake up in the morning in terms of the city where we live in. How we can do that. So I would say it's also about bringing, as all of my work, it's about bringing the different fields together. No, it's about going beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. About, Frank Ocean says, "I feel like crying, but I can't think I broke it." Edna O'Brien, the novelist, says, "Write from the deepest well within you." There's also, Joe, you made a really interesting point that you said there are kind of different typologies of sentences in it, which I also never thought about so much until you made that point earlier tonight, when we prepared. Because of course you have, for example, with Edna, that's almost like an advice, Sometimes you have an advice, and I think that's why it connects so deeply to the conversations I have with the artists, right? Because in the conversations I have certain recurring questions, right? I would ask the artists about their unrealized projects. I would ask the artists about, their advice to a younger, generation. I would often ask the artists also, in the sense of Gerhard Richter's art as the highest form of hope, what's their definition of art? And so very often, when then at the end of the conversation, I would ask them to write down, it sort of resonates. That's why it's so, in a way, conversational. But then it's also very much, as all the conversations are, about production of reality. It's about making things happen, which is why very often it's also to do with it's very much what Steve said about art being about active freedom. It's very much about doing something, about an action, Lina Diadum-Boache writes, "Make it happen, all of it, every time, regardless." That's kind of one of the last post-its in the book.
It's called 100, it's about 100 artists, but as you say, it's not about visual artists, or it's artists in the broadest sense of the word, from, as you say, musicians to architects, anyone who's doing things creative. You mentioned musicians. One of my favorites is Philip Glass, where he says, I dream of music, and in my music I dream, which I thought was beautiful. And there's
Dream appears a lot, no?
yeah, it does. Yeah, remember to dream.
That's
yeah.
Carrie Mae Weems.
yeah.
And then we have Kouchouin, there's a dog dreaming of a dog.
Yeah, it's interesting. And another one that means a lot to me, partly because it's again, as Ulrich says, when you know the person and you see their writing, it means somehow more to you rather than a typeface. And it was Zaha Hadid who we both knew. And it says, I think there should be no end to experimentation, which is, fantastic to me, meaningful, and in her writing. And when you knew her, it's just more than a few words that really, I always remember that. And it actually guides me a lot through a lot of the things that I do. But anyway, sorry, we rambled on a bit about your question.
And also, one of you asked me about my favorite ones. There is also Arca is also one of my favorite ones. To softness as a weapon when the mind attacks itself.
Any other questions or George?
Yeah, so there's obviously thousands of these post-it notes that you've collected over the years, but obviously a lot less that you've put in this book. How did you decide which ones went into this book?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We had long conversations on that, and in a way, I would say, from the very beginning, we always thought of it as a first volume, so the idea that it could actually be a series. And so we wanted, I think, to cover, that was also the conversation we had with Joe and with HENI, we wanted to cover the sort of different disciplines, so we wanted to have practitioners from all these different fields, from different generations, from different geographies, from lots of different fields. And then, of course, the idea was to have also sentences which somehow I remembered, because I mean, in a way, that was the beginning of the list. I kind of made a list of the sentences which over the years struck me most. But then, of course, memory is always, full of mistakes and is incomplete. And the moment the book went to print, I remembered all these we should have included. And that's why we do need to make a volume 2. But I was also advised by the publisher, as I always am, that one shouldn't put volume 1 on the cover.
No.
And I think this idea of, memory being incomplete, I mean, it goes back also to something, Joe, in your question you raised, why handwriting. I think also this idea, if we have, our language gets permanently corrected when we type, and how is this called in English? The self-correct. Well, text. Yeah, that kind of thing. And I think it's really interesting, this idea also that there are mistakes, in handwriting. And I do think that that's like super important. And you see also in some of the notes, that things are crossed out and, and are corrected and are written over, that kind of thing. It's maybe important.
I recently received a long letter from someone, and it was amazing. I haven't received one for ages, a proper letter written. Yeah. So it was so beautiful, really, although not totally legible, I must say. But any other questions? And please.
I find actually this the situation between analog way of expressing something and digital way of expressing. I've kind of gone through it in some way because I was studying architecture in mid-90s when there was, at least where I was studying, there were no digital tools for any computer-aided design. But by the time I was graduating, there were already, AutoCAD and things. So I kind of maybe had the fortunate experience of seeing both. But then when I started teaching architecture, I found that most students were much more readily leaning towards digital ways of drawing as compared to analog. And that actually, I felt, started changing the way things were designed to some extent, because there's some things that are much easier to sketch, which are very tough to do on a computer, while there's some other things that are good on a computer. So I think, I don't know, maybe I'm sounding old school or something, but the newer generation has a different ability with digital that we don't, and we have, at least I have, ability with analog, which perhaps they are missing in some way. So like, for example, a backwards written note by hand is still easier than writing backwards on text, because you have to start with the last word, the last letter of the last word to be able to, write the whole sentence and also have the spacing. So, yeah, I'm just, I think that both have their value in some way, It is whether we are able to identify what works better for what task, and are able to kind of choose and, use that. And it's just a comment, I guess.
Yeah, and I agree with that fully, because I think it's all about mixed reality, and it's to you, and using it, whatever, it's convenient. I mean, let's take, for example, Ian Chang, no? Which is somehow connected to that. So Ian Chang, it's a kind of between a text and a drawing. He made this graveyard of email. Rest in peace, email, 1971 to 2020, because he's convinced that email is an obsolete, medium. And when you talk to Ian, who is one of the first artists actually, to do works with AI, and he did Bob, which some of you might have seen at the Serpentine. When you talk to Ian, as an artist who works so much digitally, he says when he draws, actually, when he has to develop the characters, it's still much faster to hand draw them. But then he immediately goes digital. So that's an example for that, no? Yeah. So I agree.
I totally agree with what you're saying. And so I think probably generally one should be quite good at analog and computers, really, to get the benefits of both and to be able to, as you say, use the right one in the right situation. But I do think that, maybe I'm wrong, but this is an idea anyway, the way you express yourself and the means through which you use to express yourself starts affecting the way you think as well. And so that's important. If you just limit yourself to analog, then you'll think in that way. And if you limit yourself to computers, you'll always be not necessarily caring how you spell, and it'll be finished for you, or soon it'll be just through AI, and you'll become lazy. Your mind will actually change. Like I said, I never forget that great lawyer who sat down and wrote those beautiful words without stopping. He could also speak in that way, which you could never do unless he used a pen and pencil to write. Anyway, sorry, but I think that's a really good point, to not just limit yourself to one means of expressing yourself or one tool. Thank you for that. Any others? Sorry, I've talked too much. You can, yeah.
Shout out. Have you ever been left conflicted by any post-it note that sent to you that you kind of potentially don't agree with, or that just left you feeling uncomfortable in any way?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a platform where obviously, I post these post-it notes by different artists, by different practitioners, and it's not necessarily, my opinion always, but it is definitely, that's why it's also a polyphony. But I wouldn't say uncomfortable, not so far, no.
More questions? There you go.
I'd be very shocked if the answer was yes, but I'm wondering if you've ever forgotten to photograph or you've lost the post-it note?
Yes, actually, there have been some lost post-its, but they've been photographed before.
And some eaten ones as well, which has been photographed. More questions or observations?
Actually, there was once an Instagram post, I forgot exactly when it was, where an artist put liquid tar on a post-it note. And we photographed that, but we couldn't possibly, scan it or transport it. Or so it was kind of left behind. So sometimes it's also, sometimes it's performative.
Well, maybe a very profane question, but do you forget? Because it seems like you have a lot of input every day and a lot of artists that you're interviewing, and so a lot of posters and a lot of conversation. Do you go back and review your conversation and take time where you're just alone and read the post-its and the conversations, or do you just archive?
Yeah, I mean, that's also super interesting, because I think that happens a lot, to go back to conversations, particularly at the moment of, because, the conversations are repeat conversations. I speak to artists over many, many years, again and again and again. And, this morning we did a conversation with, Avery Singer and Simon Denny. I've known them both for 10 years, ever since they began, So obviously before we have this conversation where we discussed a lot mixed reality, how they work between painting, both of them, between painting and digital art and blockchain and so on. So, I would read all the previous conversations we've had and then build on that and look at, so that's the moment when that mostly happens. I would say also with the post-its, making the book was a great moment to kind of go back and just read some of them again. But in general, there is never enough time for that. Also, whenever I do a talk or when I have to write the text on an artist, when I'm asked to write a monographic text or whatever, then I would again, revisit the whole history of it. And so, yeah, in a way, freely quoting Panofsky, the future is often invented with these fragments from the past. Yeah, and also conversations can lead to text that leads to new conversations. So in a way, Philippe Pareno, who did, it's actually interesting in relation also to Ted's question, right? How this can travel beyond the page. Philippe Pareno already anticipates it because he made the post-it as a T-shirt. So, moved, without motion. And he always says in French, la chaîne est belle, no? The chain is beautiful. And I think a lot of my work has to do with these infinite chains, And that's also why the projects usually never stop. I think that somebody asked me yesterday if now that the book is out, the project is finished or is concluded. I feel it's far from concluded because I still find it very exciting and it's become a daily ritual in a way almost, And I think we live in a world which is bereft of rituals. We kind of need more rituals. And so, Jimmy Durham, the late Jimmy Durham, he wrote, humanity is not a completed project. So we could say, remember to dream, or that the handwriting project is not a completed project in a way. I would also say that in terms of memory, I wanted to point out one thing which really also struck me. We're working on a survey at the moment of Judy Chicago for the Serpentine, and I was really moved when I reread this post-it of Judy Chicago, because it was almost like, there's almost like and that's maybe another dimension of it, that these little post-it notes, they almost function like Proustian Madeleines, like when Proust talks about these memory triggers. And so I remember when I read this very precisely, that this is the first time Judy Chicago came to my office, and we recorded a conversation. It was about 12 years ago, and I remember that I was like really nervous. I had never met her, and I remember exactly every second of that conversation reading the post-it. So in a way, that's in relation to the question about memory also there. That's quite they are Proustian Madeleines. So Judy wrote one of the most intimate relationships of my life. And it's kind of nice in relation to also to your question from the beginning, right? Why handwriting? Judy said, one of the most intimate relationships of my life is my hand drawing or writing on paper, which is becoming sadly a lost art, And then she did this amazing, drawing, which is also handwriting. That's another example, where drawing is writing in a way. You have a question here?
I do have a question. And I'm kind of mechanical and boring, so this question may have no meaning at all, but you asked for an observation. And these are all post-its. Is there any reason why the cover is not written in the post-it?
Why the words don't fit in the post-it, yeah. Well, that's probably a question for the designer, yeah, who unfortunately couldn't be here. But let's just see where that post-it is in the book and see whether it's been adapted. It's by, yeah, I'm just trying to work out which page is it? It doesn't answer the question about which page it is.
Carrie Mae Weems is page 94. It's page 94, but it's very different. Her handwriting is different from the cover, so this was clearly the graphic designers.
Someone took a creative license with that.
Yeah, exactly. And I could try and justify it, but that's, maybe trying to make the words be even more important and outgrow the post-it, but it was a designer decision. And I think it was the right decision. I think it looks very good.
Also, Irma Boom is very sorry not to be here tonight, but she wants to come to London for another celebration of the book, so we'll have a conversation where she will explain it.
I've noticed she's also changed the handwriting as well as taking outside the post-it. Yeah.
Also, one thing I forgot to say before is that some of it is also kind of meta. So, so sometimes it's also a post about the post, no? So that's, of course, it's also reverential, because whenever you have a space, I mean, that's something which I find so interesting with the constraint, no? I mean, because you mentioned the post-it, and here Irma goes beyond the constraint of the post-it, right? But most of the time, it's within the constraint. And I think what is interesting, it's a little bit the same, like if you visit, for those of you who haven't come yet, there is a few more weeks to see the Serpentine Pavilion by Lina Gottme. Now, that's similar to the post-it. So yeah, one might wonder, how does the pavilion connect to the post-it? And it does, because the pavilion happens almost like a post-it on a small piece of land in front of the Serpentine. It's an extreme constraint for an architect to design this pavilion, right? And so ultimately, obviously, when there is such a constraint, the question is, how is there freedom within the constraint? And obviously, the architects are extremely astutely aware of what the previous architects have done over the years. Lina was very aware of what Sumaya Wali had done, what Theaster Gates had done. Was very aware, and little by little, all kinds of possibilities of working with this little plot of land are somehow, tested, or architects for at a certain moment. I remember when Herzog de Meuron and Ai Weiwei did the pavilion, they said, nobody has ever been digging. We want to dig. We want to make archaeology, so they went into the ground and so on. So with the post-its, it's similar, you very much have that idea also of sometimes kind of like meta comments, post-its about post-its which reflect the constraint of the post-its, or also post-its which reflect my project in a way, like Fred Moten, do I get to write anything I want? Is a kind of a great question, no?
There's another point, which, although you thought you were raising a mechanistic question, it's really quite a philosophical question. Some of the artists have said, I'm not doing it on a post-it, I want to do it on an A4 sheet of paper, or as in David Hockney's beautiful one, it's going to be a red sheet of paper. And so automatically they're changing the parameters of what Hans Ulrich has suggested. He pulls out his yellow post-it pad and they say, forget that, I'm going to do it on a T-shirt. So it's not just about the post-it. Well, it's not about the post-it at all. That's just a starting point. Does that fit? Yeah.
That's totally true. And also, then there brings to my mind something else also in relation to the question, that also the post-it is in a way the rule of the game, no? And I think that somehow, I started when I was sort of 16, 17 to visit artists and to curate exhibitions. And one of my mentors, I had, numerous artists were mentors of mine. I had all these amazing artists whom I visited as, as a teenager. And one of the mentors was of course, Christian Boltanski. And he said that a show should always have a rule of the game, And so then we did do it, where the rule was that every artist came up with an instruction. And this idea, that has something which stayed with me for a lot of group shows, which afterwards also became these infinite chains. There's also Take Me, I'm Yours, which was my first show at the Serpentine as a guest curator in the mid-90s. Again, with Boltanski, the rule of the game was, that all the artworks could be actually taken away. So people could do their own exhibition with the exhibition in the apartment. There were badges, and there were, images you could take from the wall, and there were all kinds of things. And in a way, this project is part of that, the idea of there being a rule of the game. So that's why it's somehow related to my mentor, Boltanski. And then, of course, it's also about the idea of just spending time, with artists. It's about, it's all about time. I mean, if you would sort of add up the project, the Instagram project, if you think there are 4,000 post-its, and and I've spent 2 or 3 hours each time with an artist in a conversation, the whole project is about 12,000 hours. So that aspect of time, I think, is important. As and Gilbert and George write, to be with art is all we ask. So I could say to be with artists is all we ask. And I think, in a way, one thing I forgot before when we talked about the digital and and the analog, and your great point about that, one of the points where this comes together in a rather extreme way is, of course, when I interviewed the inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, and I asked him then to handwrite what the World Wide Web is all about. And he hand wrote famously, you know, the motto, which was also his contribution to the inaugural Olympic ceremony, right? This is for everyone. And that's kind of super interesting, you know, at the time when, in his view, the digital space is not so much for everyone, and there's a fast internet for people who pay, and he has a whole foundation who, you know, fights for this idea that the internet is for everyone. And that's a kind of an interesting way where the digital space and the analog space kind of maybe come together.
Amazing. Any more questions or observations? All right, well, thanks so much for coming, and I think Hans Ulrich is going to hang around for a little bit longer. If you want any books signed, he'll sign them, if I may suggest them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.